On today's show, the Toronto Raptors firing head coach Nick Nurse. Why was it time to finally move on from Nick Nurse? Who are the possible replacements as the next head coach in Toronto? And is the heat starting to turn up a little bit on Masai Ujiri? All of that and more coming right here at Locked On NBA.
You are Locked On NBA, your daily NBA podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up and welcome to another edition of Locked On NBA, the biggest stories with the local experts. I'm your host, Jackson Gatlin, also host of Locked On Rockets right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. Now, today's episode is brought to you by PrizePicks. Next game, how about Jason Tatum to score more than 26.5 points? What about LeBron James to have more than 7.5 rebounds? How about Kevin Durant to have less than 6.5 assists? Or what about Steph Curry to have more than 3.5 three-pointers made? So, what is PrizePicks? It's daily fantasy sports, but how does it work? Basically, you pick 2 to 6 players, and if they score more or less than their PrizePicks projection, you can win up to 25 times back on your money on any entry that you submit. There's no competing against other people. It's just you versus the projections available. And PrizePicks offers projections on any sport that you watch. That's NBA, NFL, MLB, NHL, PGA. They've got you covered for all of the action over at PrizePicks. Entries can be made in 60 seconds or less. It's that simple. They're safe. They offer fast withdrawals. Currently operational in over 30 states and Canada. So download the PrizePicks app or go to prizepicks.com to sign up and play daily fantasy sports. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with promo code LOCKEDON. If you deposit $100, PrizePicks will give you $100. If you deposit $50, PrizePicks will give you $50. So don't forget to enter promo code LOCKEDON at sign up for an instant deposit match up to $100. Joining us now is the host of Locked On Raptors, Sean Woodley, who you can find wherever you listen to your podcasts and on YouTube. Just search Locked On Raptors. And Sean, this feels like something that, it felt like we saw the writing on the wall a while back for Nick Nurse, but it has finally happened. The Raptors moving on from Nick Nurse, firing him. Why was it time to finally move on from Nick Nurse for this Raptors organization?
Yeah, first off, is it seeing writing on the wall if the guy who gets let go is the one who put the writing there? Look, yeah, this isn't, I think, a terribly surprising move for the Raptors. Obviously, I think a couple weeks before the season, before a very massive game for the Raptors, when Nick Nurse sort of telegraphed his intention to take some time to reflect and think about what his next steps were going to be while still being under contract for another year beyond this one for $8 million. That seemed like a bit of a red flag to suggest that, maybe this is not going to be a long marriage beyond this with the Raptors and Nick Nurse. And frankly, I think it was time. I really think it just, sometimes change for the sake of change in the coaching position can be a good thing. I don't always think that with players. I think making trades for the sake of making trades is a one-way track to becoming like Brian Colangelo. But when you are dealing with coaches, sometimes the voice wears thin, and sometimes the team context requires something different, a bit of a different look. When Nick Nurse got hired by the Raptors back in 2018-19, this was a veteran-laden team that had gone through all sorts of playoff disappointment. They made a massive trade for Kawhi Leonard not long after they hired Nurse, but the thought here was this team needs a tactician. This team needs someone who can pull the right levers and cranks in the playoffs. And boy, oh boy, is Nick Nurse ever good at doing that. This Raptors team can't even get to the playoffs right now. Of course, missing out with the play-in loss, the very embarrassing play-in loss to DeMar DeRozan's daughter and the rest of the Chicago Bulls. I think at the point where things are right now, the long-standing for the course of this whole season sort of rumors and whispers and burblings about discontent within the locker room, a lot of that seemed to be, is this player-to-player discontent? Actually, it seems like a lot of it was player to Nick Nurse discontent. And so considering all of that, considering where the team finds themselves, and just 5 years into Nick Nurse's very aggressive stylings, kind of, it just feels like maybe it was time for a new voice and a change. And I'm sure Nick Nurse is going to go get hired somewhere and be very successful right away because he's a very good coach.
Talking about, bringing in a new voice, time for a change. I mean, who are some of the preliminary names kind of on the horizon right now that might be the next head coach in Toronto? We know that Ime Udoka was heavily rumored originally. What are some of the other names that are kind of in the running right now? And who would you maybe like to see get a shot being the next Raptors head coach?
Yeah, the names right now, Ime Udoka's been out in the ether for a few months now, honestly, like ever since the Nurse stuff started to kick up. I think around March is when we first started to hear noise about that. And Udoka's name has been there. The other names that came up in the early reporting from Shams Charania over at The Athletic were Jerry Stackhouse, former Raptors 905 head coach, former Raptors assistant, very good relationships with the franchise, was awesome when he was here, was super successful with Raptors 905. And then Patrick Mutombo, who's an assistant with the Suns right now, was the 905 coach last year. And you know, just sort of anecdotally, for a franchise that used to really be sort of ahead of the curve when it came to using the G League team to support the the NBA level team. That's kind of fallen off in recent years, and it's actually kind of heartening to me to hear that Jerry Stackhouse and Patrick Mutombo are among the names that'll be talked to. I would imagine they'll cast a wide net. The last time the Raptors hired a head coach, they hired an assistant who was on Dwayne Casey's bench when he got fired back in 2018, but they spent about a month looking at other candidates. Ime Udoka was one of them then. As far as who they're going to hire, I really don't know right now. It seems like they're just very much in the early stages of trying to figure out exactly what it is they're looking for in a coach. For me, I think, like I mentioned before, they need somebody who can come in and kind of command the room and set up roles and define roles and make it so everyone kind of knows what they're doing when they come to work every day. It's a small thing, but it seemed like a thing that was really lacking with Nick Nurse. And especially when it came to like the best players on the team. How did they interact? Who's the lead ball handler? All that stuff. All of that was very unclear, and there was very little direction all season long. So someone who can walk in, garner the respect of a locker room that has vets and young players and everyone in between, that to me is the type of guy they should be going for. And I really, really don't think it's time for the Raptors to go and hire Ime Udoka. I know he's a very successful coach. I know there's lots of conflicting and unclear reporting about what actually happened when he was in Boston, but regardless of all of that, regardless of the moral reasons you might not want to hire him, the Toronto Raptors just spent the last season embroiled in strife in their locker room, and there was just no identity, no connectivity, no cohesion. Masai Ujiri talked about how this just was not the Raptors. It seems weird then for that team to go and hire a guy who's going to bring so many questions and distractions. Just does not feel like the time for me for the Raptors to go after Ime Udoka. If I had my preference, Jerry Stackhouse is a good enough pick for me. He seems super fun. Back when he was the Raptors 905 coach, when $50 was the fine for a technical foul in the G League, he was asked, how are you going to cover all your texts, Jerry? And he said, I'm just going to cut a check for a G. That's the kind of energy I want coaching my basketball team. Bring in Jerry Stackhouse, baby. I'm all for it.
Is Masai Ujiri on the hot seat now, or is the seat starting to heat up a little bit moving forward?
I would say they've kind of played their last card, the Raptors front office, and it's hard to know, right? Because Masai Ujiri is so embedded into the structure of the Raptors ownership group now, the MLSE. He's more than just the team president. He has all sorts of different responsibilities at MLSE, and he's not really the guy who oversees the day-to-day. He's got final call and say on stuff, but Bobby Webster is the GM who handles most of the day-to-day stuff. I don't think the heat's on them just yet, but with this firing, that's kind of the last card that most front offices play, right? Is you fire a coach and then the heat starts to be turned toward you. The other part here is the Raptors have set themselves up with a very difficult offseason where they got to thread the needle. They have 3 pending free agents. They have a roster that's just not complete. They had about 7 or 8 reliable players all season long. There's not enough shooting. There's not enough guard play. They've got to make serious changes to this roster, or at least serious upgrades and alterations in the areas where they were super weak last year. And if they don't pull that off, if this offseason, which is going to be operating under a razor-thin margin with those 3 pending UFAs, if they can't pull this off, if 2 of those guys, or one of them even, the wrong one leaves in free agency for nothing between Jakob Poeltl, Fred VanVleet, and Gary Trent Jr., then I think absolutely going into next season, all eyes will be on the front office and how long the patience is for MLSE, this sort of titanic corporate overlord that owns the Raptors, where it's really hard to tell, like, when will they get tired of the Raptors losing? They obviously have seen what the Raptors are when they're a cash cow, when they're really successful. If you go multiple years without reaching those heights, then maybe questions start to get asked. But I don't think this heat's hot just yet. But those who like to turn the heat on for seats are getting their charcoal ready. I don't know. Bear with me on the metaphor, but it's not long until we see the Raptors front office really start to come under scrutiny, especially if this offseason is not a resounding success.
You mentioned some of the big questions facing this Raptors team this offseason. I guess really big question here is, is it worthwhile right now for this Raptors team to try and stay competitive this offseason, be it retooling, retaining this core, or is it maybe time to consider pivoting into a bit more of a rebuild for a brief period of time, however long that may be?
I don't think we're going to see a full-scale rebuild. This is just not something the Raptors do, and their philosophy is we can build from the middle. We can build a winner from the middle, and they've proven they can do that. Masai Ujiri took over an extremely mid to bad team, didn't do a full teardown, just kind of tinkered, brought in different parts, gave it time, and had patience with letting it kind of germinate and grow into something. And all of a sudden, the Raptors of last decade turned 7 years of really great, successful basketball into a championship because they were relevant, they were in the conversation, and they were ready to strike when Kawhi Leonard became this distressed star that they could go and trade for. I assume that's going to be how they go about it here. There might be some changes to the core players. Maybe one of OG Anunoby or even Pascal Siakam gets traded. Maybe they don't bring back Fred VanVleet. All these things could go down. Maybe they get real crazy and trade Scotty Barnes in a superstar trade. I don't think anything's like necessarily off the table. But I do think that, Masai Ujiri spoke about this in his availability on Friday after the Nick Nurse announcement. He's not someone who's going to tank. He believes in winning and having a winning culture. And with the way the Raptors are set up, they owe a top 6 protected first round pick next year from the Jakob trade, a trade that Masai Ujiri seemed absolutely happy to have made. And the way Jakob played, you can justify it, I think. Especially if they can keep him back. Obviously, if he walks, and that's a whole different story, and that the heat on the seats gets turned up a little quicker. But I think this is not a team you're going to see go full teardown rebuild. This is a team that has proven that you can build a winner from the middle. And I know there's this sort of stinky stigma to being a 41-41 team, being stuck in the worst place in the league. Well, guess what? Like 75% of the NBA is in the mushy middle now. And this was another point of Masai Ujiri's. It doesn't take a lot to climb from that range into the range where you're a legitimate playoff team and you actually can sort of envision yourself a path to a deep playoff run. This team won 48 games a year ago. There's still plenty of talent here. They're considered underachievers for a reason because they have good players. I don't think you're going to go see them trade those good players for futures. I think they'll rather see how they can make those good players work together in a more cohesive fashion. And that's going to be the big job of whoever they bring in to be their head coach.
What direction will the Raptors go as an organization? Who will be the next head coach in Toronto? Of course, you'll have us covered for all of that and more over at Locked On Raptors. Sean, I appreciate you stopping by Locked On NBA with me.
Anytime, Jackson.